Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. Whatever time you're tuning in the program on flinttalkradio.com. This is the program called What's Going On. I'm George Moss, the host of the program, and we come on every Monday, usually from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock. But we are taping 30-minute segments. In my absence, I will be in Africa when this airs. And so we are doing some programs ahead of schedule so that we'll be able to air these at the regular time, but they'll only be for one half the time we're normally here in the afternoon. So you'll be watching this program, those of you who are watching it in what it would be normally real time, but this is a taped segment from 2 o'clock to 2:30. And those of you who pick it up later on understand it's an abbreviated program. We'll get back to the regular programming, which is an hour long, when I come back from the continent of Africa, where I'll be for 3 weeks doing some studies and going to a couple of places where I need to do some additional research for a class I'll probably be teaching in the fall. And I need to do some field research in order to prepare for that class and other classes that I'll have later down the road a piece. So with that in mind, I want to talk about something that kind of lends itself a little bit to this particular excursion, and maybe we can kind of tie it into the travel that I'll be involved in by the time that you are getting this piece. My teaching responsibilities now at this stage in my career has to do with the Africana Studies Department, and I want to talk a little bit about this film that was put in movie theaters on July the 2nd by Dinesh D'Souza, called America, asking the question, what would the world be like if there were no America or had never been in America? And I contend that America is more than just a place in terms of a geographical boundary. It's also an idea in the world. And what I wanted to say was that D'Souza does a good job in that, but not everything he says in the film is accurate. And I want to talk a little bit about that in terms of the slavery aspect. What D'Souza says in the film is that the North fought a war, and Lincoln fought a war in order to end slavery on the soil of the United States. And so he gives this benevolent intent behind the 4-year war in which some 600,000 persons died. And now keep in mind that D'Souza is an immigrant to the United States, and although he has a handle on the history a lot more than some of the ones who've been here and call themselves scholars, historians, in many ways he understands it better as an outsider than many persons understand it by being on the shores, because he understands it from a distance. But there's some things he does get wrong. And one of the things in the film he got wrong was his takeoff of why the war was in fact fought between 1861 and 1865. And I want to try to come behind that part of the presentation and say a few things about it in terms of what I think the historical record will, in fact, will allow us to conclude, without it being conjectural or without it being prejudicial based upon by the narration of fact rather than the narration of fiction. Both are narratives, but we want to stay as close as we can to what we can sustain based upon the record. Therefore, the information can be looked at through the lens of history and not through the lens that we are creating because we want to read a certain way in history, which is quite a different kind of treatise. So D'Souza sees the Civil War as being fought by more or less the good guys in the North who wanted to end slavery in the South. And if that were the case, he would have to explain a couple of things, at least, and probably many more things besides. One of which was the riot that took place in New York, which was the riot that took place when it became a war that was won to end slavery, which would be 2 years after the war had actually started. And the New York riot was an anti-draft riot, because if the slaves were in fact going to be freed off the plantations, which is not what the war was being fought for when it started out, then why should people who are going to be injured by the slaves now being put in the workforce, why would they want to fight a war and then have the slave population that's now held in a certain part of the country away from the jobs, and therefore not driving down the wages in other parts of the country where slavery is not being practiced? Why would they want to engage in that kind of benevolence when it in fact would amount to cutting off their nose despite their face? I mean, why would people act in ways in which they shortchange their own self-interest? And I don't think anybody should ask anybody to, this is an Ayn Rand point of view. I'm using it to extrapolate in terms of the specific issue of slavery, but she's talking about it in more comprehensive terms. But I don't think you can ask anybody to sacrifice their own self-interest for the self-interest of another. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're elevating another person's life over and above your own life. And that makes of the person a sacrificial animal, because you're saying that someone else's life is more worthy than your own life. And when a person does that, or has that as the parameters of how he operates his own life, he's become a sacrificial animal, because he's sacrificing himself or herself and his life and or her life for the life of another person. And you do, that's what you do in terms of sacrificing animals to take the place of you asking human beings to do what animals have been asked to do in the past. So when the war became a war to that's also going to include freeing the slaves, when what it had been before that was a war to stop secession, out of which came the necessity of ending slavery, because it was now clear that the war would not be concluded as quickly as they thought it would be. It had gone on for 2 years and didn't seem to be in any way abating. The South was not losing the war on the battlefield because of the brilliance of his generals, Stonewall Jackson just being one of them, the one that was really taking the battlefield over was General Robert E. Lee, one of the great military minds in history, who had stepped down from his commission as a Union Army soldier, and once the war became began to be fought, and he was aware the war was pending, resigned his commission in the Union and went back to his own state, Virginia, and defended his state, which shows you something about the country at that time, which they looked at themselves as being a nation of independent states who had voluntarily conjoined to come together out of their own mutual interests and their mutual security to form the United States, which they had done voluntarily, but retaining their sovereignty as independent states if it behooved them to do otherwise. And that had been threatened off and on throughout the time that the Union had been, the Constitution had been drawn up in 1787, all the way up to 1861, really starting in 1860, in December of 1860, when states began to leave out of the Union. But they've been threatened throughout the history of the United States, going back to the Declaration of Independence that said, when in the course of human events, And it went on to say that whenever a government stops doing that for which it was in fact set up to do, then it is the duty of the people to rise up to alter that government or to abolish that government. And that's what we see happening in 1861, starting in 1860 when the first of the states began to succeed. 11 of them would eventually join into it. Later on, 11 states would be in the Confederate States, forming a new country because they had decided to exercise their sovereignty rights to leave the Union. And so then the issue is, will they be allowed to leave none without violence, or will they be stopped by the central government from doing that? And there were two different opinions on the table. One was an opinion that was in fact held by Lincoln's predecessor, the 15th president, Buchanan, and his view was that, well, the Constitution doesn't allow for the federal government to intrude. If they wanted to voluntarily relinquish their relationship to the Union, then they were able to do that. And that was really the way it was seen by some of the states that were not in the Confederacy to start out with. I mean, 4 states went and joined the Confederacy when Lincoln said no to their seceding from the Union. They were going to stay in the Union at that point. But when they saw what they thought of as tyranny, they decided to join the Confederacy. That's why it would have 7 before Fort Sumter and had 11 eventually, because 4 other states that were in the Union initially, when the war set out, 4 states, these were slave states, decided that they could not be a part of a union that would in fact stop free states from exercising that which was in line with the Declaration of Independence had stated, because of the objection to tyranny on the part of King George III. And they saw the same thing being now carried out by President Abraham Lincoln. I know that we don't see it in those terms right now, but that's the way it was viewed in that time period. One other argument against the war being a war against slavery was the fact that there were slave states in the Union, which is not often times taught, and we don't think of slaves being in the Union. But the fact is that Union states had slaves also, 4 of them, called border states. Each one of them had slaves, and those slaves comprised about 800,000 persons in Delaware, in Kentucky, in Maryland, and in Missouri, which were called border states, meaning they bordered both on the south and the north, and they were in between the two. And those 4 states stayed in the Union, although they were slave states. And also the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a military doctrine issued by the President Lincoln in order to weaken the military foundations of the South, because the slaves were the ones that were producing the crops, cotton being one of those crops, but also producing the food of the Army. If they could in fact stop that process or slow it down, or to in some way impede its ability to be as productive as it had been over the first 2 years, then that's a tactic that had to be tried, because it was now clear that this was not going to be a war that's going to end anytime soon. In New York, when they had the riot, there was a poem. It was an anti-draft riot. They had a poem that came out at the same time called "The Naygurs," and they spelled it Naygurs. The Naygurs' right to be killed. And the poem went, "Some say it's a burning shame to make the niggers fight, and that the threat of being killed belongs only to the white. But as for me, upon my soul, so liberal are we here, will let Sambo die in place of myself any time of the year. And you can see that the war sentiment has now been shifted from fighting the war to preserve the Union to now one where it's now being viewed as one in which, in that preservation of the Union, what's going to happen is those slaves are going to come off that plantation now. And that was not the design of the war when it first of all started in what amounted to in April of 1861 with the firing of Fort Sumter, which both factions, the South, meaning the Confederacy, and the North, contended that Fort Sumter belonged to each of the two parties. The South saying that they seceded from the Union, and therefore the fort in the harbor of South Carolina was now a part of another nation, therefore it belonged to the Confederate government, and for tax purposes. And the North was contending that secession was not possible because the endorsement was made to be a part of the Union, and therefore it was a contract that could not be abrogated unless it was abrogated by both parties. And although the South had said yes, the Union had said no, and therefore the contract between the two parties could not be canceled because both parties that agreed to the contract did not agree to, in fact, abrogate its provisions. And that's the war that is being fought, with slavery becoming into it as a peripheral, as a non-peripheral issue later on. But at the very beginning, it was not considered to be the peripheral issue. In fact, slavery was one of the ways in which the Union was going to be made more solid, was to make slavery more secure inside of the United States. And that was on the table at the time the war came to a close. So I think that viewpoint, De Sousa did a brilliant job in the film, but that's one viewpoint that he could have done more research on. Because what Lincoln was doing, and said as much, is that what Lincoln was doing was doing what governments do right now, and that is the collection of taxes cannot be abrogated. In fact, soon after the Union was set up after the Revolutionary War came to a close 4 years later, after the Treaty of Paris had been signed in 1783, 4 years later when you draw the Constitution up and then ratified in 1788, soon after that occurred, one of the first things that happened was that George Washington has to, in fact, ride against the people that are in rebellion against paying taxes on whiskey, called the Whiskey Rebellion. And George Washington rides against those those leading a tax revolt in as early as the 1791, I think it was, when the tax revolt occurred in places like Massachusetts, in the backwaters of those states. And the idea was you would not be allowed not to pay taxes, which the war was fought over taxes to break away from the British. But taxes is now at the helm of the new government as well, in terms of the taxes that were being assessed against the citizens at that point in time. There's no income tax, but there is an excise tax. And there are other taxes. And one tax is the tax on the backwaters where brew is being made. And those taxes are going to be paid. And George Washington ruled against it in order to make sure they were paid. Well, what Lincoln says, when the Union was being separated, I don't think we can say it torn asunder, because you would have had 22 states in the Union, 11 states would have gone outside the Union, and you would have had twice as many states in the Union as were out of it. And if 11 could, in fact, set up a country, then certainly 22 could have done it. But that was not going to be the case, because it's going to be militarily put down as a rebellion of the states rather than a secessionist movement. and Lincoln said as much in his letter written to Horace Greeley on August the 20th, is it August 22nd or is it September 22nd of 1862, where Lincoln said his paramount object in the struggle was to in fact preserve the Union, and that if he could do it by freeing no slaves, he would do it. And if he could do it by freeing one slave and leaving others alone, he would do that. But whatever he did for the colored race, and that's the word he used, which was the word that was used at that time, whatever he did for the colored race, he did it because he believes that it preserved the Union. And 100 days later, what is necessary to preserve the Union, as he sees it now, is to sign the Emancipation Proclamation that had been threatened 100 days prior to that in September, I think it was September 22nd of 1862, when Lincoln is threatening that if the Union was not made whole, with those 11 states coming back into the Union, he was saying 100 days ahead of time that if that were not the case, then their slaves would be, in fact, freed henceforth and forevermore. He never said anything about the slaves in Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. But in the rebellious states, then that would be the consequence of bearing arms and maintaining the bearing of those arms against the government of the United States. And therefore, the Emancipation Proclamation 100 days later, because guns were not laid down, they still are picking up guns. They still are using the guns that they picked up in 1861 to confront the government, and the second of what would have amounted to the second revolution on American soil. And this, unlike the revolution in 1776, was put down by the superior forces on the soil, wherein it was impossible to do so on the part of the British, who had fought a war for 7 years before they understood that this rebellion could not be put down, not with the mother country's forces coming from abroad across the Atlantic Ocean, and they had to put down a rebellion that was inside the land space and was in fact being fought on a guerrilla warfare basis, which, by the way, when the war was no longer tenable on the part of the South, many of those persons thought they appealed to Robert E. Lee to continue the war, but fight it on a guerrilla basis, since they could not, given their numbers, continue the war confronting each other just to do a hit and run piece, which is how the Revolutionary War had been won in 1783. But that's not what Robert E. Lee, who had honor, he had been defeated on the battlefield, and Robert E. Lee was honorable enough to say that we have been defeated, and therefore signed the agreement to end his proclamation of the war, which for all practical purposes ended elsewhere, because Robert E. Lee was the general of note. If he's not going to fight, then fighting elsewhere was not tenable. And so the war ends at the courthouse where he signed the agreement with General Grant, and that brought the war to a close. And it's at that point then that the promised emancipation could now be could be invoked, which was impossible before, because the Union did not have control of those states where the invocation was supposed to be put into place. He could not enforce it because the war still being prosecuted. So that was just not possible until Lee had in fact surrendered. Now the president could exercise and be true to his word, and you couldn't go back on his word by saying he didn't mean it, and so because the world was watching also, and so that was put in place. But people need to understand that if that were the ending of the story, then you would not need what happened next, because the war comes to an end in April of 1865. But in December of that year, Congress passes through 2/3 vote in the House and 2/3 vote in the Senate using Article 5 of the Constitution, it proposes, and of course the Congress proposes an amendment, but it cannot bring about the amendment. That has to go to convention or a resolution by 3/4 of the states. So Congress can propose the amendment. It cannot ratify the amendment, which is another way of looking at the federal system and the separation of powers, putting so much power in different parts of the American character and its institutions, so that not one part of it could become dictatorial and dominant. I wish we could, teach that to the present regime. But they proposed in December the 13th Amendment, and why would that be proposed if the Emancipation Proclamation had already done the work? The answer is that it had not done all the work. It only did the work in those parts of the now restored Union that had been rebelling against the Union and were brought back by force into the Union. And now they have to be held as a conquered province, because the war doesn't end the fighting. I should say it ends the fighting, it doesn't end the resistance. And so now we have to secure the peace. And that's why you have the military occupation of the South when the war comes to a close, because now you have to enforce the provisions of the Emancipation Proclamation. But they're not finished yet. They have to now pass an amendment to be consistent, because how are you going to enforce the provisions in the southern states and say that you're going to end the slavery there, and then you maintain it in the states that were never outside of the Union, which were 4 states in number? You can see the problem that the country has. And plus the former slaves are now in limbo. What does it mean? And that's not clear. And so the 13th Amendment then brings about the total resolution of slavery in the United States. And therefore the 800,000 slaves in the 4 border states, now they can join into the ending of slavery in their names, as it happened in the 11 Confederate states. And that's what, and the 13th Amendment is really aimed at the Union states and not aimed at the southern states, as most persons think of. And I think that's something that I don't think this is not comprehended by D'Souza, but sometimes when you're doing a film and there's so many different parts of it and he has so many different things you have to connect, you don't have enough time to develop all of it as necessary to go into all the details. But his conclusion, though, that this war was a war with slavery is incorrect based upon the balance of the information that we have available to us and is known pretty widely, although not widely reported. And so that is one of the failures of the film. But there are enough things he got right to correct what most people that are commenting about the history of the country have gotten wrong almost in every detail of the country's history. The imperialist understanding of the past, that's incorrect. Almost everything that's been taught, quite frankly, about history, where there's a real put down, which I didn't get this when I was in college, because the teachers were not. I think we had patriots in the classes, pretty much in the southern schools, but much of it has been this transition has occurred recently in the last generation, where we now are getting a skewed view of history, where America is wrong in every detail and everything is engaged in. So D'Souza does a good job on balance in terms of correcting that record, but that particular part of it is a little bit off kilter. Okay, well, we will be back sooner than the blinking of an eye, because this is the last of the 4 programs we did before leaving for Africa, and we'll be back now full-time next week, which will be from 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock, our usual time, and we will greet you then at that particular point. Until next time, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.